James spent 22 years behind bars for a crime he insisted he didn't commit, the murder of his wife, Emily. But 5 years after his release, everything changed when he saw her living a new life with a different family. What really happened to Emily, and how could the man who mourned her for decades have been so wrongfully accused? This is the story that will challenge everything you thought you knew. James and Emily's life was something people in their small town admired. They were seen as the perfect couple, young, loving, and full of hope for the future. Everyone who met them thought they had everything going for them. James worked as a mechanic at a local garage, a job he enjoyed because it kept him busy and allowed him to support his family. Emily was a school teacher, known for her kindness and dedication to her students. Together they seemed like the kind of couple who would grow old side by side, raising their daughter and building a peaceful life. Weekends were spent at the park, family dinners filled with laughter, and evenings sharing stories before bedtime. They dreamed about the future, planning to buy a bigger house, save for Lily's education, and maybe even take a long family vacation someday. Life felt simple, stable, and happy. But beneath the surface not everything was as perfect as it seemed. James often noticed Emily seemed tired when she came home from work. She was quieter than usual, sometimes lost in thought, and occasionally avoided talking about her day. Emily brushed it off when James asked, saying it was just stress from school or fatigue. James wanted to believe her. He thought everyone had tough days and that things would get better with time. Emily also started spending more time on her phone, sometimes stepping outside to take calls in private. James felt a growing distance between them but wasn't sure why. There was no obvious sign of trouble, no arguments or fights, only a quiet tension that neither of them talked about. He assumed she might be dealing with something at work or maybe with family, but she never gave him a reason to worry too much. The town was small and everyone knew each other. People often stopped James to ask about Emily or to comment on how lucky they were. There were even whispers about how they made a great couple and would probably be together forever. Emily was well liked by the community and at school, so her sudden disappearance shocked everyone. No one could understand how something so awful could happen to a woman who seemed so full of life and love. One cold autumn night, everything changed in an instant. Emily had gone out after dinner, telling James she was meeting a friend for coffee. It was late when she left and James expected her to be back within the hour. Hours passed, then a whole night, but Emily never returned. James tried calling her phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. He grew more anxious with every passing minute, his heart pounding with worry. By morning James was frantic. He searched everywhere, from her favorite coffee shop to the places she often walked. No one had seen her since the night before. The police were called and a missing person report was filed. The entire town got involved, organizing search parties and sharing flyers, but days turned into weeks, and there was still no sign of Emily. The absence left a heavy silence in the home they had shared. James tried to hold on to hope, convinced she would come back. He spent countless hours at the police station, pleading for answers and refused to believe that anything terrible had happened. But as time went on, fear crept in. The perfect life James had known was crumbling, replaced by confusion and dread. The woman he loved was gone, and no one could explain why or where she had disappeared to. Weeks after Emily vanished, the hope that she might still be found alive began to fade. The town's search parties had scoured every inch of the nearby woods, trails and abandoned buildings, but there was no sign of her. The police investigation, which had started as a missing person case, soon took a darker turn. One cold morning, a local hiker stumbled upon something chilling near a remote forest trail. Emily's body. The discovery shocked everyone who knew her. She was found in a small clearing, partially hidden beneath a fallen tree. The authorities arrived quickly and sealed off the area. The news spread through the town like wildfire, turning grief into shock and disbelief. How could something so tragic happen to someone so beloved? The town was left searching for answers, desperate to understand what had gone wrong. The police reported that Emily had been murdered. The cause of death was blunt force trauma, and the scene showed signs of a struggle. It was clear she had fought to defend herself, but the killer had been relentless. There were no eyewitnesses, no immediate suspects, and no obvious motive. The town's peace was shattered, replaced by fear and suspicion. As the investigation progressed, attention quickly shifted to James, her husband. Police questioned him extensively. Although James maintained his innocence, some details didn't add up. Neighbors reported hearing raised voices from the couple's home the night before Emily disappeared. Some said they heard what sounded like an argument. Others mentioned that James seemed unusually nervous in the days following Emily's disappearance. The whispers in the community began to grow louder. The evidence against James was mostly circumstantial. Police found a few items with his fingerprints near the crime scene, which he claimed he had no explanation for. There was also a small amount of blood on his jacket. However, forensic tests could not definitively link the blood to Emily. Still, the investigators took these findings as signs pointing toward James's guilt. The media picked up the story, portraying James as a troubled husband capable of violence. His reputation, once respected and admired, began to crumble under the weight of suspicion. Friends and neighbors who had once supported him started to distance themselves. Rumors spread quickly, some exaggerating or fabricating details to fill the gaps left by uncertainty. Despite James's insistence that he had nothing to do with Emily's death, the police and prosecutors built a case against him. They believed jealousy or anger over a hidden argument had escalated into tragedy. But no one could explain why James would harm the woman he had shared so many years and dreams with. The community was left grappling with difficult questions. How could someone who seemed to have a loving relationship commit such a horrific act? Was James telling the truth, or had the evidence been misunderstood? For many, the fear that danger lurked so close to home was terrifying. Behind the scenes, James's family began to prepare for a long fight to clear his name. They believed in his innocence, even as the world turned against him. But with mounting pressure and a case that seemed stacked against him, the path ahead was uncertain. As the investigation closed in, the mystery deepened. What really happened on that night? And why was the woman everyone mourned no longer alive? The answers seemed just out of reach, hidden beneath layers of fear, pain, and suspicion. The small town braced itself for the storm to come, unaware that the truth was far more complicated than anyone could imagine. The day James was arrested felt like a turning point that no one could have predicted. The police arrived at his home early in the morning, taking him into custody before the sun had fully risen. The small town buzzed with shock and curiosity. Many people watched from their windows or gathered quietly outside, whispering about what had happened. The man they once trusted, the father and husband who had shared so many happy moments with Emily, was now accused of the worst possible crime, her murder. From the moment he was taken, James maintained his innocence. He could not understand why the police believed he was responsible. To him, the evidence felt like a puzzle missing crucial pieces that might show someone else was behind Emily's death. Yet the system moved fast, and soon James found himself in a cold, sterile interrogation room, facing questions that seemed designed to trap him. The investigators focused on inconsistencies in his story. They pressed him about where he was the night Emily disappeared, why his fingerprints were found near the crime scene, and the blood on his jacket. James tried to explain, but his answers only raised more suspicion. Without a solid alibi, and with neighbors reporting arguments and strange behavior, the police began to believe that James was hiding something. Word spread quickly in the town. Some people who had supported James before now whispered behind his back, convinced that the man they knew had a dark side. The local news ran stories portraying him as a violent husband, feeding the growing fear and anger in the community. The image of James shifted from loving father to possible killer almost overnight. Despite this, James's closest friends and family refused to give up on him. They believed he was innocent and that the truth would eventually come out. His sister, mother, and a few loyal neighbors stood by him, attending court hearings and offering what support they could, but even their faith could not stop the isolation James felt. Everywhere he went, he was met with suspicion and judgment. The legal process moved forward, and the case against James began to take shape. Prosecutors built their argument around the circumstantial evidence, the arguments overheard by neighbors, and the absence of any other suspect. They argued that James had a motive, jealousy or anger, and that he had the opportunity to commit the crime. The lack of direct witnesses did not stop them. They painted a picture of a man driven to violence behind closed doors. Throughout the investigation, James insisted he was telling the truth. He pleaded with the police to look deeper, to find the real killer, but his words fell on deaf ears. The justice system, overwhelmed by the pressure to solve the case and bring closure to a grieving community, was focused on securing a conviction. The trial was tense and emotional. The courtroom was filled with townspeople eager to see justice. The prosecution presented their case with force, using expert testimony, forensic reports, and the stories of neighbors. James's defense was limited. Without strong evidence to prove his innocence, their arguments often sounded like desperate attempts to cast doubt. In the end, the jury found James guilty. The verdict shocked some, but others felt relief that the mystery was finally solved. James was sentenced to life in prison, the judge emphasizing the severity of the crime and the pain caused to Emily's family. As he was led away in handcuffs, James looked out at the crowd one last time, a man broken by a tragedy he claimed he did not cause. Behind the scenes, questions lingered. Had the right man been convicted? Was justice truly served? But those doubts were drowned out by the finality of the sentence. James's life was changed forever, and the town settled into a new reality, one marked by loss, suspicion, and unanswered questions. The nightmare that had begun with Emily's disappearance was far from over. The trial that followed James's arrest became one of the most talked about events in the town's recent history. From the start, the courtroom was charged with emotion. The community wanted answers, and everyone seemed to have an opinion on what had happened to Emily. The judge, the lawyers and the jury faced the difficult task of sifting through a tangled web of evidence, accusations, and heartbreak, to reach a verdict that could never undo the tragedy. The prosecution worked hard to build a case portraying James as a man driven by anger and jealousy. They focused on the arguments neighbors reported hearing, painting a picture of a relationship that was not as perfect as everyone had believed. They argued that James's fingerprints at the crime scene, the traces of blood found on his jacket, and his failure to provide a solid alibi, all pointed to guilt. Witnesses testified about the tension they had sensed between James and Emily in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. The prosecution's case was emotional and persuasive, appealing not just to the facts, but to the pain and grief felt by Emily's family and the community. The murder of a beloved wife and mother had shaken the town to its core, and the courtroom became a place where that pain was laid bare. The jury was told that convicting James was necessary to bring justice and closure. On the defense side, James's lawyers faced a tough battle. They argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof he had committed the crime. They pointed out that no eyewitnesses had seen James harm Emily and emphasized his consistent claims of innocence. The defense suggested the possibility that someone else had killed Emily, but the police had failed to find that person because of a rushed investigation focused on James. Despite these efforts, the defense struggled to counter the emotional weight of the prosecution's case. The jury was made up of people from the same community where the crime had happened, many of whom knew James and Emily personally. The strong feelings surrounding the case made it difficult for some jurors to separate their emotions from the facts. Throughout the trial, James appeared quiet and withdrawn. He did not speak much, except through his lawyer. His hope rested on the possibility that the truth would come out and that the jury would see his innocence. But as days turned into weeks, the courtroom became a place where his future was being decided with little room for doubt. The closing arguments were powerful. The prosecution reminded the jury of the brutal reality of Emily's death and the evidence pointing to James. The defense urged the jurors to consider the possibility of reasonable doubt, warning them not to convict a man without solid proof. In the end, the jury's decision came swiftly. After only a few hours of deliberation, they found James guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence. For many, the verdict confirmed their worst fears, while for others, it raised questions about whether justice had truly been served. James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge spoke about the brutal reality of Emily's death and the evidence pointing to James. The defense urged the jurors to consider the possibility of reasonable doubt, warning them not to convict a man without solid proof. In the end, the jury's decision came swiftly. After only a few hours of deliberation, they found James guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence. For many, the verdict confirmed their worst fears, while for others, it raised questions about whether justice had truly been served. James was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge spoke about the seriousness of the crime and the impact on Emily's family, hoping the sentence would bring some measure of peace. But as James was taken away, a deep uncertainty remained. For James, the nightmare was only just beginning. The truth of what happened that night still felt out of reach, hidden behind the walls of the courtroom and the finality of the verdict. Prison was a harsh new world for James, one he was forced to enter with a heavy heart and a mind full of questions. The life he once knew, his home, his daughter, the dreams he and Emily had shared was now distant and seemingly unreachable. Every day behind bars was a struggle, not only because of the physical restrictions, but because of the constant reminder of what he had lost. The prison walls felt cold and unforgiving, and James often found himself haunted by memories of Emily and the life they once had. Despite the grim surroundings, James refused to accept the label of a murderer. He knew deep down that he was innocent and clung to that belief as tightly as he could. It became his driving force, the one thing that kept him going when hope seemed impossible to find. He spent countless hours thinking about what had really happened that night and wondering how the truth could be uncovered. Life in prison was isolating. Other inmates often kept their distance, unsure whether to trust a man convicted of such a serious crime. James had to learn how to navigate the harsh social rules of prison life, while maintaining his own sense of integrity. He avoided conflicts as much as possible, focusing instead on small routines that gave his days some structure. Reading books, writing letters and keeping his mind active were ways he tried to hold on to a sense of normalcy. One of the hardest parts was being separated from his daughter, Lily. He missed her terribly and worried about how she was coping without him. Visits were infrequent and brief, leaving James with a deep ache in his chest every time he left the visiting room. The thought of Lily growing up without a father present was one of the cruelest realities. He hoped that one day she would understand the truth about what had happened, and know that he had never hurt her mother. Over the years, James sought help wherever he could find it. He wrote letters to lawyers, journalists, and advocacy groups, trying to bring attention to his case. He asked for DNA testing and re-examinations of the evidence, hoping that new technology might reveal something missed in the original investigation. Each request was met with delays or rejection, but James refused to give up. The prison staff noticed James's persistence and determination. Some saw him as a man broken by tragedy, but unwilling to surrender to despair. Others were more skeptical, believing that the legal process had already run its course. Still, James's resolve never wavered. He kept pushing for justice, even when it seemed like the world had turned its back on him. The years passed slowly, marked by routine and reflection. James used the time to learn new skills, taking advantage of educational programs offered within the prison. He hoped that when, or if he ever regained his freedom, he would be ready to start a new chapter in his life. But the uncertainty of his future loomed large. Despite the loneliness and hardship, James held on to a small flicker of hope. Deep inside, he believed that the truth about Emily's death would one day come to light, and that he would be free to reunite with Lily. This hope was a fragile but vital thread, weaving through the long years of confinement and keeping his spirit alive in the darkest moments. Prison was not just a physical prison for James, it was a prison of lost time, shattered dreams and unanswered questions. Yet even in the bleakest days, he never stopped believing that justice might still find him. After more than 2 decades behind bars, a new chapter began to open for James, one he never dared to imagine. Advances in forensic science had transformed the way cold cases were investigated, and technology that didn't exist during his trial was now giving hope to many wrongfully convicted people across the country. James's case caught the attention of a specialized cold case unit that had been formed to review unsolved crimes and questionable convictions. This team of investigators saw potential in his story and decided to take a fresh look at the evidence. The cold case unit approached James's case with cautious optimism. They requested access to the physical evidence collected at the crime scene, including blood samples, fingerprints, and other materials that had been carefully stored for years. What had once been analyzed with the limited technology of the 1990s was now examined with far more precise and sophisticated methods. The investigators hoped these new tools might uncover something that had been overlooked or misinterpreted. One of the key breakthroughs came with DNA tests. For the first time, forensic scientists were able to analyze tiny traces of biological material with extreme accuracy. The tests revealed something startling. DNA found at the crime scene did not match James. In fact, it belonged to an unknown individual, someone whose identity remained a mystery. This discovery challenged the entire foundation of the case against James and suggested that the real perpetrator might still be out there. The cold case team worked quickly, comparing the DNA profile to national databases and exploring other leads connected to the unknown suspect. While the trail was cold, the existence of this unknown DNA was enough to raise serious doubts about James's guilt. It became clear that the evidence used to convict him had been incomplete and that the investigation might have been rushed or focused too narrowly. Armed with these new findings, James's legal team filed motions to reopen the case and request his release. The court agreed to review the evidence, and after months of hearings and evaluations, the judge ruled in favor of James. The conviction was overturned, and James was finally freed after 22 long years in prison. The news spread quickly. The town was stunned by the revelation that the man they had believed to be a murderer was actually innocent. Some felt shame for having judged James so harshly, while others struggled to accept the new truth. For James, the moment was overwhelming. After decades of injustice, he was walking out of prison a free man. Though his freedom was a victory, it came with a heavy burden. James had lost 22 years of his life, years he could never get back. He faced the challenge of rebuilding relationships, especially with his daughter who was now grown, and had lived most of her life without him. The world outside prison walls had changed in ways he could barely imagine. At the same time, the mystery of the unknown DNA and the real circumstances of Emily's death remained unsolved. James wanted answers not just for himself, but for his daughter, the community, and Emily's memory. The cold case unit continued their investigation, hoping to find the person responsible and bring true justice. James's release was both an ending and a beginning. After so many years of waiting and fighting, he was free, but his life was far from normal. The scars of wrongful conviction ran deep, and the road ahead was uncertain. Yet with renewed hope and the truth on his side, James was determined to uncover the full story of what had really happened on that fateful night. James stepped out of the prison gates after 22 years, blinking against the bright sunlight of a world that had moved on without him. The streets, the faces, even the technology, everything seemed unfamiliar and overwhelming. He carried with him a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and uncertainty. Freedom was not the easy answer he had imagined. It was the start of a new challenge, one that would test him in ways he had never expected. The small town he once called home had changed too. Some people welcomed him back with open arms, feeling sorry for the years he lost behind bars. Others were skeptical, their opinions shaped by years of believing the worst about him. The newspaper headlines had shifted from convicted killer to wrongfully imprisoned, but the echoes of suspicion still lingered in the air. James had to navigate these complicated feelings and find a way to rebuild his life, piece by piece. One of the hardest adjustments was reconnecting with his daughter Lily. She was no longer a child, but a young woman who had grown up without her father. Their relationship was fragile and filled with years of silence. Lily had been raised by Emily's parents, who had kept her far from the scandal and pain that surrounded the case. Now James faced the difficult task of earning her trust and helping her understand the truth of his innocence. It was a slow process, marked by cautious conversations and tentative steps toward healing. James also struggled with the practical realities of life outside prison. Technology had advanced, social norms had shifted, and even the job market was different from what he remembered. Simple tasks, using a smartphone, accessing public transportation, managing money, felt like new challenges. With limited resources and a criminal record still shadowing him, James found it hard to secure employment. He often felt like a stranger in his own world. Despite these obstacles, James was determined to move forward. He sought support from organizations that helped wrongfully convicted individuals reintegrate into society. They offered counseling, legal advice, and connections to resources that eased his transition. James also began speaking publicly about his experience, hoping to raise awareness about wrongful convictions and the flaws in the justice system. Sharing his story became a way to reclaim his voice and find purpose beyond his past. The memory of Emily remained a constant presence in James's mind. He had mourned her for so long, believing she was gone forever. Now freed from prison, but still searching for closure, he tried to piece together what had really happened to her. The mystery of Emily's disappearance and death lingered like a shadow over his new life, preventing him from fully moving on. As James walked the streets of his hometown, he sometimes felt eyes watching him, some curious, some judgmental. The community that had once turned against him now faced the truth of their mistake, and that revelation stirred mixed emotions. Some neighbors reached out, offering apologies or simply a quiet acknowledgement. Others kept their distance, unable or unwilling to confront what had happened. James knew rebuilding trust would take time, both with others and within himself. The years lost to wrongful imprisonment had changed him, leaving scars that would not easily fade, but with each day, he grew stronger and more determined to create a new path. Freedom was no longer just the absence of bars, it was the chance to reclaim his life, to seek justice, and to find peace. Though the road ahead was uncertain, James was ready to face it, step by step, with hope and resilience guiding him forward. Life after release was a whirlwind for James, filled with both hope and confusion. Though free, he was caught in a strange in-between world, no longer a prisoner, but not yet fully part of the life he had lost. Every day brought new challenges, and the weight of his wrongful conviction still hung heavy over him. The biggest shock came when James unexpectedly discovered something no one could have predicted. Emily was alive. It happened during a chance encounter one afternoon. James was walking through a nearby town, trying to rebuild his life, when he saw a woman who looked exactly like Emily. His heart raced, disbelief flooding his mind. Could it really be? He watched from a distance, noticing she was with a family, a husband and 2 children, living a peaceful, ordinary life. The woman's smile, her gestures, even the way she moved were unmistakably Emily's. James's world spun out of control. For years, he had mourned her death, carried the guilt and sorrow of losing her, and endured decades of punishment for a crime he did not commit. Now suddenly, the very foundation of everything he believed shattered. If Emily was alive, what had really happened? How could she have disappeared without a trace, only to build a new life under a different identity? And most importantly, why had no one told him? He tried to approach her, but the woman disappeared before he could speak. No one recognized him, and it became clear that Emily had created a new life carefully hidden from her past. The shock left James reeling, questions piled up, with no easy answers. Determined to find out the truth, James began investigating quietly. He learned that Emily had legally changed her name, and moved to another state years before his arrest. She had remarried and started a new family, living far from the town that had mourned her supposed death. It was a secret that no one in their small community had ever known. James struggled to understand Emily's reasons. Had she run away from danger? Was she protecting someone? Or had she deliberately abandoned her family and left him to face the consequences? The uncertainty tormented him. Everything he thought he knew about their life together was suddenly called into question. At the same time, the discovery raised doubts about the original investigation and prosecution. If Emily was alive, then who was the victim found in the woods? Was it someone else entirely? The police department faced difficult questions, and some officials quietly reopened the case. However, many people in the community found it hard to accept the truth. For years they had believed James guilty and mourned Emily's death. Now that belief was turned upside down. James also had to confront the complicated feelings inside himself. Relief that Emily was alive, mixed with anger, confusion, and betrayal. He felt robbed of the years he spent grieving her loss, and paying a price for a crime he didn't commit. The discovery reopened old wounds, but also gave him new hope. Hope that the real story would finally come to light. Though the path ahead was uncertain, and fraught with emotional turmoil, James knew one thing for sure: his fight was far from over. The truth about Emily's disappearance, and the mystery of the woman found dead in the woods, needed to be uncovered. James was determined to seek justice, not just for himself, but for the woman he loved and the family he had lost. The journey would be long and difficult, but now he had a reason to keep moving forward, no matter what.